The day Marcella Keene rode onto the Hadley ranch with fury burning behind her eyes and a list of grievances tucked inside her coat pocket. She had not expected to leave with a full stomach and a heart that felt, for the first time in years, like it might actually belong to someone worth giving it to. It was the spring of 1882, and the New Mexico territory was alive with the kind of restless energy that came after long winters. The land still catching its breath, the grasses pushing through the cracked red earth, the sky wide and unforgiving over the mesa country. Marcella had ridden 6 miles from the town of Cimarron in the cold morning air, her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her jaw set with the kind of determination that made men step aside when they saw her coming down the main street. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a sheep rancher who had died the previous autumn and left her the property, the debts, and the singular problem of Owen Hadley. Owen Hadley owned the largest cattle operation in the whole northern stretch of the territory. He was 32, broad-shouldered, and known for being straight with his word in business, which was why what had happened 3 weeks ago had cut Marcella so deeply. His cattle had broken through the fence line separating their properties for the second time in 2 months, trampling nearly an acre of her alfalfa, and when she had sent word to his ranch asking for compensation and an apology, she had received neither. What she had received, through his foreman, was a message that the fence was her responsibility and that she ought to get it repaired properly. That message had sat inside her chest like an ember ever since, and she had finally decided she was done waiting for a reply that was never going to come. The Hadley ranch spread wide across the valley, a main house built from adobe and timber, a long barn painted red that had faded to the color of old brick, and pastures rolling out in every direction, dotted with cattle and cottonwood trees. When Marcella rode through the gate and up the long path toward the house, she passed 2 cowboys working a horse in a round pen. One of them looked up, nodded at her with the polite caution that men in the territory always offered a woman riding alone. She nodded back and kept riding. She had barely dismounted and tied her mare to the hitching post before the front door of the house opened, and Owen Hadley stepped onto the porch. She had seen him in town before, across the street or at the general store, but she had never stood this close to him. He was taller than she remembered, with dark hair that had been pushed back from his face and a jaw roughened with a few days of beard. He wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the morning chill, and he was holding a tin coffee cup in one hand. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has surprised him, not unpleasantly, but with genuine uncertainty about what was happening. "Miss Keene," he said, and his voice was measured, careful. "Mr. Hadley," she said. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the piece of paper she had written on at her kitchen table the night before, a clear, itemized account of the damage to her alfalfa field, the cost of repair, and the fact that she had sent a letter asking for acknowledgement 3 weeks ago and had been told through a third party that the matter was her own problem to solve. She climbed the 2 porch steps and held the paper out to him. He set his coffee cup on the porch railing and took it. "I wrote out here because I want you to read that, and then I want you to look me in the eye and tell me whether or not you owe me an apology," she said. "Because I have been patient, Mr. Hadley. I have been more patient than I should have been, but I am done waiting for you to do the right thing on your own." He did not look away from the paper while she spoke. He read it. She watched his face, looking for the dismissal or the irritation she expected from a man of his standing, but what she saw instead was something slower moving, something that looked like recognition or maybe shame. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and held it out to her. "You're right," he said. She had not expected that. She had prepared herself for an argument. "I beg your pardon," she said. "You're right," he repeated. His voice was quiet but completely steady. "My cattle broke your fence. That is my responsibility regardless of what condition the fence was in beforehand. And the message my foreman delivered to you was wrong of me to send. I should have come myself. I should have come 3 weeks ago." He looked directly at her now, and his gray eyes were serious and without deflection. "I apologize, Miss Keene. I'm genuinely sorry for the damage to your field and for the way this was handled. It wasn't right." The ember in her chest, the one she had been feeding with irritation for 3 weeks, shifted into something else entirely. She had expected a fight. She had planned for a fight. She had rehearsed the fight during the entire 6-mile ride. The apology landed on her like an unexpected rain on a dry afternoon, necessary, welcome, and slightly disorienting. "Well," she said after a moment, "thank you. I'll send someone over to repair the fence line properly at my cost," he continued, "and I'd like to compensate you for the lost crop. If you'll tell me what a fair figure is, I'll see it's paid." She had the figure already. She had written it in her letter. $12, she said. "That's what the alfalfa would have brought me." $12 it is. He nodded once, like a man closing a deal. Then he looked at her with an expression that was difficult to place, not quite uncertain, not quite hopeful, but somewhere in that country between the two. "Miss Keene, have you had breakfast yet?" She stared at him. "I was just about to sit down," he continued. "Rosa makes enough for half the territory on a good morning, and I've been eating alone for long enough that the table feels like poor company. You're welcome to join me if you'd like." She thought about saying no. She thought about it very seriously. She had come here to be angry, and the anger had been handled with such unexpected grace that she wasn't entirely sure what she was supposed to do now. The ride home was 6 miles, and her stomach had been empty since before dawn. "I suppose I could eat," she said. The kitchen of the Hadley house was warm, smelling of wood smoke and biscuits, and something savory that turned out to be a cast-iron pan of salt pork and fried potatoes that a woman named Rosa Medrano had prepared with the efficiency and quiet authority that Marcella immediately respected. Rosa was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes that assessed Marcella in a single glance and seemed to arrive at a favorable conclusion, because she set an extra plate down without being asked and poured coffee without any ceremony. Owen pulled out a chair at the kitchen table for Marcella, which she found slightly startling, not because she was unused to courtesy, but because she had expected him to be the kind of man who didn't bother with it in his own home. She sat down. He took the seat across from her. For a moment neither of them spoke, which should have been awkward but was not entirely. The kitchen was a comfortable room, worn table, mismatched chairs, a window looking out toward the barn where the morning light was coming in gold and level. A shelf on the far wall held a row of books that she noticed were actually used, their spines creased and a few of them leaning at angles that suggested they had been taken down and replaced many times. "You read?" she asked, nodding toward the shelf. He glanced at it. "When I can. Winters are long." "What do you read?" "Right now I'm working through a geology book. New Mexico has some interesting formations. Before that it was a book about cattle disease management, which was less interesting but more useful." She looked at him. "A geology book. The land is worth understanding," he said simply, and there was no self-consciousness in it. He was not trying to impress her. He was just saying what was true. Rosa placed a platter of biscuits on the table, and Marcella took one and broke it open and felt the warmth rise against her fingers, and something in her loosened, some held thing that she had been carrying for a long time that had nothing to do with the fence or the alfalfa or even Owen Hadley. "My father would have liked you," she said, before she had thought the words through. "He believed in reading books too. He said a man who doesn't read is just borrowing someone else's opinions without knowing it." Owen smiled at that. It changed his face entirely, softened it, made him look younger and more open. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "I was sorry to hear about his passing." "Did you know him?" "A little. We spoke a few times at the land office. He had opinions about water rights." He paused. "He was right about them too, as it turned out." "He usually was," she said, and the words came out softer than she intended, carrying the particular tenderness of grief that had not yet finished moving through her. Owen did not push forward into the space that comment created, did not offer the kind of hollow condolence that people offered when they felt obligated. He simply nodded and reached for a biscuit, and the quiet between them was respectful. They ate. Rosa refilled the coffee. Outside, a rooster was making his noisy announcement somewhere near the barn, and one of the cowboys called out something in Spanish that got a laughed reply from somewhere farther away. The ranch was alive and working around them, and sitting in the middle of it felt, to Marcella's surprise, less like being in a stranger's house and more like being in a place that functioned, that breathed, that had a pulse. "How are you managing the property?" Owen asked. "After your father?" It was a direct question, but not a rude one. In the territory, the practicalities of land management were always legitimate conversation. "Managing," she said. "I have 2 men who have been with the property for years. Good men. The sheep are healthy. The debt on the land is smaller than people assume." She paused, deciding to be honest rather than defensive. "It's the small things that are harder, the things my father knew without thinking about them, who to call when the well pump sticks, how to read the grazing rotation so the land doesn't tire, things you learn slowly." Owen nodded. "I know that feeling. I was 24 when my father died. I had help, but there was still a gap where his knowledge had been, and filling it took years." She looked at him. "I didn't know your father passed 8 years ago. Heart went out on him in the middle of October." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." He said it simply, without ceremony, the way a person says something true that they have made peace with. They finished breakfast slowly, which surprised both of them. The conversation moved in the way that good conversation does when 2 people are genuinely interested in each other's thinking, not performing, not filling silence out of obligation, but actually engaging. She told him about her father's system for grazing the sheep across the mesa grassland, and why she thought it was sounder than most people's approach. He talked about a problem he had been having with a water source on the eastern boundary of his property, and asked if she knew the geology of that drainage, which she did, because her father had mapped every water source on their shared mesa boundary years ago. By the time Rosa cleared the plates, an hour had passed without either of them marking it. Owen walked her to the porch when she rose to leave. He took the $12 from a drawer near the door without her having to ask again, folded it, and held it out to her. "I'd like to send Jenkins over to look at your fence line tomorrow if that suits you," he said. "He's the best fence man I have." "Tomorrow suits fine," she said. She took the money, tucked it in her coat pocket, and then stood for a moment in the morning air that had warmed while they were inside. The sun was higher now, the cottonwoods throwing dappled shade. "Mr. Hadley." "Owen," he said. She looked at him. "Owen," she repeated, trying it out. "Thank you for breakfast." "Thank you for coming," he said, and he said it with such genuine directness that she found herself halfway down the porch steps before she realized she was smiling. She untied her mare, swung up, and rode back down the long path toward the gate. At the gate she looked back, not planning to, just turning because something in her wanted to see whether he was still on the porch. He was. She rode home with the $12 in her pocket and something else tucked quietly inside her chest, something she had not arrived with and did not quite have a name for yet. The fence was repaired the following day, just as Owen had promised. Jenkins was a compact, efficient man of about 40 who assessed the broken section, said very little, and rebuilt it better than it had been originally, with new posts and proper wire that Marcella could see would hold for years. When she offered him coffee, he accepted it briefly, drank it standing up, thanked her, and went back to work. She stood at her kitchen window watching the repair being done and felt the peculiar satisfaction of a wrong being made right. 3 days later, a rider came to her door with a message. She expected it to be something about the fence or about the remaining details of the crop compensation. What it was, written in a firm, straight hand on a piece of paper that had been neatly folded, was an invitation. "Miss Keene, there is a community meeting at the Cimarron Schoolhouse on Thursday evening regarding the proposed water diversion on the Upper Rio Grande tributary. Given what you told me about your father's water maps, I believe your knowledge would be valuable at that meeting. I would be glad of your company if you are inclined to attend. Owen Hadley. She read it twice. She set it on the kitchen table. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat down and thought about it for a reasonable amount of time, which was approximately 30 seconds before she went to find a piece of paper to write her reply. She went to the meeting. The Cimarron schoolhouse was full that Thursday. Ranchers, farmers, a few merchants who depended on water for their operations, and two representatives from the Territorial Land Office who looked very clean and slightly nervous. The proposed diversion was a scheme pushed by a railroad-connected land company that wanted to redirect one of the main feeder tributaries to support a proposed town site 20 miles to the east. The people in that schoolroom had a great deal to say about it, and most of what they had to say was unfavorable. Owen met her at the door of the schoolhouse. He had changed from work clothes to a clean shirt and jacket, and she noticed he had shaved. She noticed this and then noticed that she had noticed it and decided that was fine. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I brought the maps," she said, patting the rolled paper under her arm. "My father drew them himself. They show the drainage patterns going back to 1871. His expression shifted with genuine interest. "That's exactly what this meeting needs. The land company's representatives have been claiming the diversion would have negligible downstream effects, and no one so far has had documentation to counter it." Inside the schoolhouse it was warm and loud, the wooden benches crowded, the air smelling of wool and lamp oil. Owen introduced her to several people she didn't know, and when the meeting came to order and the land company's representative stood up to present their case, Marcella sat very still and listened to every word. When the floor was opened for comment, she stood up. She had not planned to speak first. She had planned to wait to read the room to see where her information would be most useful. But the representative had made a claim about the tributary's capacity that she knew from her father's maps was wrong by a significant margin, and something inside her simply would not let it stand. "I'd like to say something," she said, and the room settled down. She unrolled the maps on the front desk and explained what they showed. She spoke clearly and without nerves. Her father had taught her to speak about land the way most people spoke about family, as something intimately known and worth defending. The maps showed that the tributary in question fed 3 separate downstream sources that the land company's representative had not mentioned, including the well supply for a small community of Hispanic farming families who had worked that land since before the territory was American at all. The room was quiet while she spoke. Then it was very loud. The meeting lasted 3 more hours. By the end of it, a committee had been formed to formally oppose the diversion, and the land company's representatives had left looking considerably less clean and a great deal more nervous. Marcella was elected to the committee, which she had not expected. She accepted because her father would have. Outside the schoolhouse afterward, the night air was cold and starthick, and Owen walked beside her toward where they had both tied their horses. "That was remarkable," he said. "My father built those maps over 20 years, she said. "It would have been a shame to let them sit in a drawer." "I don't mean the maps," he said. "Although those were essential, I mean the way you spoke. You didn't give them an inch they hadn't earned." She looked at him, surprised by the directness of the compliment. "I don't have patience for dishonesty dressed up in official language." "Neither do I," he said, and the simplicity of the agreement was, for some reason, deeply satisfying. They stood by their horses. The night was very still. Somewhere down the street, music was coming from the saloon, a fiddle working through something lively. "Can I ride with you as far as the fork?" he asked. "The dark comes faster than it should out on the Mesa Road." "I've ridden that road after dark before," she said. "I know you have," he said. "I'd still like to if you'll allow it." She looked at him. "All right," she said. They rode side by side through the dark, the horses moving at an easy pace, the Mesa Road unfolding before them in the blue-gray light of a nearly full moon. They talked about the water committee, about the best way to organize the documentation, about which of the other ranchers could be counted on to stay consistent in their opposition. They talked easily, the way people talk when the darkness takes away the need to arrange their faces. At the fork in the road where her path turned northeast toward her property and his continued east toward the Hadley ranch, they stopped. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "Thank you," he said and paused. "Marcella." It was the first time he had used her first name. In the moonlight his face was serious and genuine, and the way he said her name like he had been keeping it carefully and was only now ready to offer it back, made something move through her that was warm and quiet and entirely new. "Good night, Owen," she said, and turned her mare toward home. She did not sleep particularly well that night, and she was honest with herself about why. The following weeks had a new quality to them. Marcella found reasons to ride into Cimarron water committee meetings, visits to the land office, ordinary errands that she seemed to be running more frequently than before. Owen seemed to have developed a similar pattern. They would encounter each other at the post office or the general store with a regularity that could not entirely be attributed to coincidence, and each encounter lasted longer than the errand that had produced it. He came to her property to see the sheep operation, which he said he was curious about because he was considering whether a small flock might make sense on the western edge of his land. She showed him the grazing rotation her father had developed, the way the land recovered in sections, the particular hardiness of the churro breed that her father had chosen for the territory's climate. He asked good questions and listened carefully to the answers, and when he helped her move a fence section that had come loose in a late storm, he worked alongside her without the slightly superior quality that some men brought to assisting a woman with manual labor. He simply worked. She had him stay for supper that evening without overthinking it. She made beans and cornbread and the salt pork she had traded for at the general store, and they ate at her father's kitchen table while the wind came up outside and pressed against the windows. "This was his place," Owen said, looking around the kitchen. "You can feel it." "Is that strange?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's good. A place that's been lived in properly keeps the shape of the people who lived in it." She looked at the room through his eyes, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, the shelf with the cups her father had carved in the evenings, the worn spot on the floorboards in front of the stove where he had stood every morning of his life making coffee. "Yes," she said, "it does." After supper he helped her wash the dishes, which she told him was unnecessary, and he said he was already standing at the basin and it would be irrational to stop on principle. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and he looked at her when she laughed with an expression that she chose not to examine too carefully just yet. He left before full dark, riding away down the Mesa road with the kind of unhurried confidence that belonged to men who were genuinely at ease in the land they traveled. She stood on the porch and watched him go and then stood there a while longer, listening to the wind. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know a season is changing, not from a single sign but from the accumulation of small ones, each individually inconclusive, together undeniable. The thing she had not expected was how natural it felt, how unfrightening. She had expected love, if it ever came for her, to feel dangerous. This felt more like arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward without knowing it. The water committee met again the following week, and the week after that, and Owen and Marcella found themselves walking out together after each meeting with the easy naturalness of habit. People in Cimarron noticed. In a town of that size, people always noticed, and the noticing was mostly warm. Rosa Medrano, who had a network of information that extended throughout the valley with the efficiency of a telegraph system, told a friend who told another friend that Owen Hadley had been eating breakfast alone for 4 years, and that the Keene woman had been the first person he had invited inside since his ranch foreman retired to Santa Fe. The story moved through town and became, in the way of small towns, a kind of communal investment in an outcome. One afternoon in early May, Owen appeared at Marcella's gate with 2 horses saddled and a pack tied to the back of his, and asked if she had time that afternoon to ride out to the eastern mesa. He had found something he wanted to show her, he said, related to the water maps. She could see from his expression that it was not entirely about the water maps, and she told him to give her 5 minutes to put on her riding coat. They rode for an hour east of her property, up onto the higher mesa, where the land opened into a wide, shallow bowl ringed by red rock walls and filled with short golden grass. In the center of the bowl, a spring pushed up through the limestone, feeding a small pool that was completely clear and surrounded by early wildflowers, yellow and purple and small white things she didn't know the name of. "I found this 2 years ago," he said. "I've never shown anyone." She dismounted and walked to the edge of the pool and looked at the water, which was cold and clear as glass, and the flowers crowding its banks, and the red walls rising around them, and the sky above them so blue it seemed almost theatrical. "Why are you showing me?" she asked. He had dismounted too, and he was standing a few feet away, his hat in his hand, looking at her with an expression she recognized now, the careful, genuine expression of a man who is deciding to stop being cautious. "Because I wanted you to see it," he said. "Because there are very few things in this world I think are worth going out of the way for, and this is one of them and you are one of them, and I find that those 2 things belong in the same afternoon." The wind moved through the grass. The horses shifted their weight behind them. Somewhere up on the rock wall a bird was calling. She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "Owen." "Yes," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I think you should come to my place for supper again," she said. "And I think we should stop pretending that it's just about supper." He was quiet for a moment, and then the smile came, the one that changed his face, made him younger, made him entirely readable. "Thursday evening," he said. "Thursday evening," she agreed. She turned back to the pool and the flowers and stood quietly in the light, and he stood beside her, and the afternoon held them both with the particular gentleness of a landscape that has decided it approves of what it is witnessing. Thursday came with enough ceremony. She cooked properly, a proper supper, a roasted chicken that had cost her more time than she would admit and came out exactly right, with roasted root vegetables from the cellar, and a pie she had made from dried apricots because fresh fruit was not yet in season. She brushed her hair and left it down, which she rarely did, and then felt self-conscious about that and pinned it back, and then let it down again. Owen arrived exactly when he said he would, because he was a man who understood the meaning of punctuality, and he brought a bottle of Madeira wine that he said Rosa had told him would be appropriate, and he hoped it was. He had shaved again. She noticed again that she noticed. The supper was long and good. They talked about everything and nothing in the way that people talk when they are happy to be in each other's company, and are not in any hurry to get to a destination because the traveling itself is pleasant. They talked about what they had each wanted when they were young. She had wanted to see California. He had wanted to be a surveyor, and neither of them had done those things, and neither of them regretted it exactly, though the wanting had shaped them. They talked about the territory, its beauty and its harshness, its complicated history. Marcella said that the land had been held by people before it was held by people like them, and that she thought about that sometimes, looking out at the mesa. Owen agreed without qualification, said that the Jicarilla Apache had moved through this country for generations before it was anyone's territory on a map, and that the treaties had not been honored the way they should have been. It was a conversation that many people avoided, but Owen did not avoid it, and she respected that. They sat with the discomfort of it honestly, which was more than most people did. After supper, they sat on the porch in the cooling evening air. The stars were extraordinary, they always were, out on the mesa, away from the lights of any town, just the great open dark and the Milky Way arching overhead like something spilled. He reached across the narrow space between their chairs and took her hand. His hand was large and warm and work-rough, and he held hers with a deliberateness that was gentle rather than presumptuous. "I think," he said, "that whatever this is, I'd like to keep going in this direction." She looked out at the stars. I think that is an extremely careful way of saying something that could be said more plainly. She heard him breathe a small laugh. All right, he said. I'd like to court you, Marcella, if you'll let me, properly, openly, with whatever that means to you. She turned her head to look at him in the starlight. His face was serious and steady and completely honest, and she thought about how unexpected he had been from the very first moment. The man she had ridden to confront, who had simply looked at her and said, "You're right." The man who had asked her if she was hungry. The man who had shown her a secret spring. "Yes," she said. "I'll let you." He squeezed her hand, and she felt it all the way through. They sat on the porch until the night was very late, and when he finally rode away down the Mesa road, she went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the lantern light, feeling the quiet of the house differently than she had been feeling it. The quiet had been lonely before. Tonight it was simply quiet, and she was in it, and in the morning there would be things to do and things to look forward to, and that seemed, for the first time in a long time, like exactly enough. The courtship was open and unhurried and completely real. They rode together on Sunday afternoons. He took her to a concert at the Cimarron Hotel that turned out to be a single pianist who played tolerably, and a visiting singer from Santa Fe who was very good. She went with him to the stockyards in Springer when he drove a herd north for sale, and she stood at the fence and watched him work and saw, for the first time, the part of his life that he was most himself in, the way he moved through the cattle with confidence and calm, the way his men followed him without coercion, the way he knew every animal. She told him things she had not told most people, that she had been engaged once, at 22, to a man who had gone east on a business trip and sent a letter from Ohio explaining that he had decided the territory was not for him, and that he hoped she would not be too affected. She said it without bitterness, because it had been long enough ago. Owen listened and did not offer a false anger on her behalf, which would have been patronizing, but said quietly that the man must have been a fool, and he said it in a tone that was not performative indignation but genuine, simple assessment. She asked him once why he had never married. He was quiet for a moment, and then said that he had spent most of his 20s keeping the ranch alive after his father died, and that he had not allowed himself to turn toward anything personal until the land was secure, and that by the time it was secure, he had gotten so accustomed to his own company that the idea of changing the arrangement had begun to seem complicated. He paused. Then he said, "And then you showed up on my porch with a list of grievances, and I started to reconsider the whole calculation." She laughed at that, a full laugh, and he looked immensely pleased with himself. The Water Committee won their case in June. The Territorial Land Office declined to approve the diversion scheme, citing downstream impact concerns, the very concerns that Marcella's maps had documented. The decision was formally announced at a meeting in Cimarron that drew nearly the entire town, and when the chairwoman of the committee read out the decision, the room erupted in celebration. Someone brought out a bottle of whiskey that appeared with the speed of something that had been prepared in advance, and the schoolhouse became briefly and joyfully chaotic. Owen found her in the crowd, and the way he looked at her with pride so genuine and unguarded that it did not seem like something he was trying to feel, but rather something that had simply arrived in his expression without asking permission, was almost more than she knew what to do with. "Your father's maps," he said. "My father's maps," she agreed. "Come on," he said, and he took her hand in the crowded room, which was the first time he had done so in public, and she let him, and several people noticed and were very happy about it. The summer moved warmly and fully, the days long and productive, the evenings slow and sweet. Owen came to her property 2 or 3 times a week, and she went to the Hadley ranch just as often. Rosa began setting a place for her at the kitchen table as a matter of course. The 2 men who worked Marcella's sheep operation, Delgado and his nephew Berto, had sized up Owen quietly over several weeks and arrived at their own approval, which showed itself in the form of Delgado asking Owen's opinion once about a fence corner post and accepting the answer. In the small society of the New Mexico Territory, these were meaningful gestures. One afternoon in late July, they were sitting on the bank of a dry creek bed that ran along the boundary between their properties, and Owen had been quieter than usual, which she had noticed. She sat beside him and waited, because she had learned that he processed things internally before speaking, and that the waiting was usually rewarded. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. The late afternoon sun was coming sideways across the land, making the grass glow. A hawk was tracing wide circles above them. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "but I want to ask it right, not here in a dry creek bed." He turned to look at her, and his expression was so earnest and so careful, so completely without pretension, that she felt it land in the center of her like something she had been waiting for without knowing. "I wanted you to know I was thinking about it. I wanted you to not be surprised when I ask it properly." She looked at him for a long moment. The hawk circled, the grass shone. "Owen," she said. "Yes. Ask me here," she said. "In the dry creek bed." His mouth shifted. "Marcella." "Ask me here," she said again. "I don't need anything arranged, I just need you to mean it." He turned fully toward her. He took both of her hands. "Marcella Keene," he said, and his voice was low and steady and entirely serious. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him, this man who had apologized honestly and fed her breakfast and shown her a secret spring, and ridden through the moonlight and fought for the water and held her hand and told her the truth every single time she had asked him anything. And she felt the decision settle into her bones with the permanence of something that had always been going to happen. "Yes," she said, "I will." He kissed her then for the first time, cupping her face in both hands and kissing her with a gentleness that surprised her, and then didn't surprise her at all, because it was completely consistent with everything she knew about him. She leaned into it and felt the summer all around them, the warm air and the dry grass and the wide sky, and the specific joy of being exactly where you are supposed to be. They rode home separately, and she arrived at her own house and stood in her kitchen and said out loud, to no one but the walls and the dried herbs and the carved cups, "I said yes." And the house held the words with the warmth of a place that is genuinely glad. The wedding was in September, when the heat had broken and the cottonwoods were just beginning to think about turning. Marcella had thought she would want something very small, just a few people, the necessary words, nothing elaborate. What she got was a small gathering of about 40 people, which in Cimarron was not considered small at all, held at the Hadley Ranch in the yard behind the house that Rosa and 2 other women had decorated with late-season wildflowers and paper lanterns that swayed in the September breeze. Marcella wore her mother's blue dress, let out and taken in a few places by Rosa's skilled hands until it fit her perfectly. She carried a small bunch of dried sage because it was September and nothing else was blooming, and she thought sage was beautiful anyway and smelled right. Delgado and Burdo came. The water committee came. The woman who ran the Cimarron post office came and cried with the efficiency of someone who had been planning to cry since June. Rosa stood near the back and did not cry but looked extremely satisfied, which was better. Owen stood at the end of the yard in clean dark clothes and watched her walk toward him with an expression on his face that she knew she would keep for the rest of her life, reverent and stunned and joyful all at once. The expression of a man who is looking at something he still cannot quite believe is happening and is deeply, completely grateful for it. The words were said. The minister, a compact man who rode a circuit through the northern valley towns and had married many couples in many yards, spoke briefly and well. When he told Owen he could kiss his bride, Owen took her face in his hands again, the same gesture as the dry creek bed, the same careful tenderness, and kissed her while the 40 people made their various sounds of approval, and Rosa made a sound that was not crying but was in its general neighborhood. The celebration afterward was warm and long food that seemed to have materialized in quantities that nobody could fully account for. Music from a fiddle and a guitar played by 2 brothers who worked on a neighboring ranch. dancing in the yard as the lanterns came to life in the dusk, and the stars assembled overhead in their usual extraordinary fashion. Owen danced with her twice, which she knew because he was not a man who particularly liked to dance, but he had clearly decided this was an occasion that required effort. He was not good at it, but he was genuinely trying, and the trying was better than skill. "You're very bad at this," she told him during the second dance. "I know," he said. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I know that too," he said, and she laughed and leaned into him, and they swayed more or less together in the lantern light while the fiddle played. They had decided, after the marriage, that Marcella would manage her property as a working part of their combined operation. She kept the sheep. Owen adjusted his eastern grazing rotation to accommodate the shared boundary more efficiently, and the two operations began to work together in a way that made both stronger. Delgado and Berto remained her men, working her land, but they moved with ease between the two properties in the way that people do when they are working within a system that makes sense. She moved her things to the Hadley house but kept her father's house intact, visiting it regularly, tending the garden he had planted, keeping the books on the shelf dusted. She found, after a while, that living in the ranch house was genuinely comfortable. It was a real house, well made, with room enough that she and Owen could each have space without crowding each other, and with Rose's presence creating a warmth and an efficiency that she had been too self-contained to build for herself alone. There were adjustments. There always are. Owen had a habit of working until very late and then being impossible to wake in the morning, which conflicted with her preference for early rising. They sorted it out by agreeing that mornings belonged to her, the kitchen, the coffee, the first quiet hour, and evenings belonged to him, and neither interfered with the other's rhythm. He had opinions about where tools were stored. She had opinions about how the household accounts were kept. They disagreed about these things with a directness that was occasionally heated and always honest, and in every case they arrived somewhere neither of them had been standing at the start, which they both found, over time, to be one of the more interesting features of being married to someone with a fully functional mind. Rosa watched all of this with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time to see the house organized properly. In December, Marcella knew she was expecting. She told Owen on a Sunday morning when the snow was coming down outside and the kitchen was warm and he was reading at the table with his coffee. She sat across from him and waited until he looked up, and then she said it plainly. He set the book down. He looked at her. His expression moved through several things very quickly: surprise, and then something deep and private and serious, and then the smile, the full one that changed his face completely. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took both of her hands the way he had in the Dry Creek bed, and he said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with that expression that had no performance in it. "Are you well?" he asked first. "Very well," she said. He brought her hands to his mouth and held them there, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her fingers, and outside the snow came down over the mesa in a soft, uninterrupted fall. "I am so glad," he said finally. "So am I," she said. The winter was good. She was healthy, which she was grateful for. Owen developed an anxiousness that he tried to conceal, and that she found both touching and somewhat exasperating, particularly in the early months when she was tired, and he kept suggesting she rest when she was perfectly capable of doing things. She told him once firmly that she was not an invalid, and that her father's sheep needed checking regardless of her condition, and he said he understood that completely and then followed her out to check the sheep anyway, and she decided she could live with that. He read everything he could find about what to expect, which in 1882 in the New Mexico Territory was not much, and he borrowed a medical text from the doctor in Cimarron that he worked through very seriously, and then worried slightly more, which was the opposite of the intended effect. The doctor, a measured woman named Dr. Clara Hatch, who had come to the territory the year before, and was still considered a novelty in some quarters though she had quickly established herself through sheer competence, told Owen at the first visit that Marcella was healthy and strong, and that he could relax. He relaxed moderately. Spring came with the particular vigor that follows hard winters, the land pushing green in every direction, the sheep moving onto the new grass with the contentment of animals who have made it through. Marcella worked her property until early April, when the size of her body made riding genuinely uncomfortable, and then she supervised from the porch and from the kitchen table with a running commentary that Delgado and Berto had learned to respond to appropriately. The baby came on an evening in late April, with Dr. Clara Hatch present and Rosa in the kitchen and Owen somewhere between the bedroom door and the porch, covering the distance several times in each direction. The labor was long but not complicated, and when Clara brought the baby out and placed him, a boy, solid and loud and indignant about the whole situation, in Owen's arms, Marcella watched from the bed as Owen stood very still and looked down at his son with an expression that stripped everything away, all the practical steadiness and the quiet control, and left only something wholly open and undefended. "Owen," she said from the bed. He looked up at her. His eyes were bright. "Bring him to me," she said. He crossed the room carefully and sat on the edge of the bed and placed the baby in her arms, and then sat there with his arm around her and his son against her chest, and the evening light was coming gold through the window over the mesa, and Rosa had come in from the kitchen doorway and was looking at all three of them with the expression of a woman whose satisfaction has reached a depth that has no further to go. They named him Daniel, after her father. Daniel Keene Hadley came into the world with considerable personality, which showed itself very early. He had Owen's gray eyes and Marcella's dark hair, and an opinion about most things that he expressed with complete commitment from the first weeks. Owen, who had expected to be good at the practical parts of fathering, the physical steadiness, the teaching of things, the watching out for dangers, discovered that he was also, unexpectedly, wonderful at the other part, the singing and the rocking and the sitting up in the dark when the baby was not willing to sleep, which he did without complaint and with a patience that surprised even him. Marcella watched her husband with their son and thought about the man she had ridden to confront on a cold spring morning with a list of grievances in her pocket, and thought about how the most significant things that ever happen usually start as something else entirely. Daniel grew the way healthy children grow in good country, steadily, enthusiastically, and with a constant interest in everything. By the time he was walking, he had already identified the sheep as the most interesting feature of the property, and had developed a following relationship with one particular ewe that Delgado had named Philosopha on account of her pensive expression, and Daniel followed Philosopha around the pasture with a devotion that was entirely mutual. Owen taught him to ride at 3, which Marcella considered rather early and said so, and Owen said that 3 was a completely reasonable age provided the horse was the right horse, which it was, a small, brown, impossibly patient mare called Button, who had been specifically acquired for the purpose. The ranch and the sheep operation flourished together. The combined water access that Owen and Marcella's properties provided, documented and defended during the water committee fight, gave them a security that many neighboring operations lacked, and in the dry year of 1884, when other ranchers were scrambling for water rights, the Hadley operation continued without crisis. Owen was generous with his neighbors in that year in ways that cost him something, but built the kind of trust that had more value than the cost. Marcella continued to serve on the water committee, which had become a standing body rather than a temporary one. She went to the meetings in Cimarron with her father's maps, updated with her own additions, and she spoke with the same clarity she had always spoken with. Owen came when he could and sat in the back and listened with visible pride that he made no effort to conceal. In the winter of 1884, she was expecting again, and this time the waiting was easier because she knew how to read her body now and knew what the tiredness meant and did not fight it as much. Owen had also learned, over the 2 years since Daniel, to be supportive in ways that were useful rather than anxious, and the second pregnancy moved with more grace than the first. The second child was also a boy, born in August of 1885, and they named him Robert. Robert was quieter than Daniel in his first months, and then abruptly became louder than anyone had anticipated, a development that Daniel found exciting, and that Owen and Marcella found simultaneously wonderful and exhausting. The house was full now in the way that houses become full when children live in them, not just with people but with noise and movement, and the particular chaos of things being where they shouldn't be and small voices asking questions, and the general impression that the world has gotten larger. Owen, who had spent years in a house that was careful and orderly and somewhat lonely, moved through the new fullness with an ease that told her everything about what he had been missing and hadn't fully known it. Rosa, who was theoretically thinking about retiring to live with her daughter in Santa Fe, kept finding reasons to stay. The reasons were named Daniel and Robert. One evening in the fall of 1885, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Marcella and Owen sat on the porch in the cooling air the way they had sat on porches since the beginning, her father's porch, the ranch porch, one or the other on any given evening since the first one, when she had ridden back under the stars from their first water meeting. He had his coffee. She had her tea. The mesa was dark and the sky was as full of stars as it had ever been. "Do you remember," she said, "that I came here to fight with you?" "I remember," he said. "I had everything planned out, what I was going to say, how I was going to hold my ground." "I know." "I could see it in your face when you rode up." A pause. "I had been avoiding dealing with it for 3 weeks because I knew you were right and I hadn't decided what to do about it yet." She looked at him. "That's a little embarrassing." "Extremely embarrassing," he agreed with complete equanimity. "Avoidance is one of my less admirable qualities. You dealt with it directly when I showed up." "You didn't give me much choice," he said, and the warmth in his voice was old and sure, the warmth of a man who has been grateful for a specific fact for a long time. "You stood there with your paper and your complete unwillingness to accept anything less than the truth, and I thought, this woman is entirely correct and also I need to know her better." She laughed. "You thought that?" "I thought something in that general vicinity," he said. "And then I asked if you were hungry, which was the most rational thing I have ever done." She reached over and took his hand, the same way he had once taken hers on her father's porch under the stars. His hand was the same large, warm work rough, completely familiar now, carrying the texture of years rather than weeks. "The fence," she said. "The alfalfa," he said. $12, she said. $12, he said, "was the best $12 I ever spent." She leaned against his shoulder and looked out at the dark mesa and the stars and the land that they shared between them now, the land that had been her father's and his father's, and before either of them, the land of people who had lived here without any paper saying they had the right to. She thought about all of it, the full and complicated history of the place, the water underneath it, the sky above it, the spring in the mesa bowl with the wildflowers, the dry creek bed where he had asked her the question she had not waited for him to arrange properly. Daniel called out from somewhere in the house, not upset, just awake, the way children are sometimes just awake, needing to confirm that the world is still there. Owen started to rise and she put her hand on his arm and rose herself, going inside through the warm kitchen and down the hall to the small room where Daniel was sitting up in his bed looking curious rather than frightened. "Mama," he said. "I'm here," she said, and sat on the edge of his bed and put her hand on his hair. "Are there coyotes?" He asked. He had heard them the night before and had developed an interest. "Probably," she said. "They live out there." "Do they know we live in here?" "I think they do," she said. "I think everybody knows the arrangement." He considered this and found it acceptable. She tucked him in and he was asleep again before she reached the door. She went back to the porch and sat back down beside Owen, and he handed her tea back to her without asking, and she took it and they sat in the dark together with the sound of the land all around them. The coyotes probably out there somewhere. the cattle settling for the night, the sheep on their side of the fence, the water running underground from the spring toward the sources she knew by heart from her father's maps, the stars doing what they had always done over this country. Indifferent and brilliant and entirely reliable. The years that followed were good years. Not perfect. There were difficult seasons. A cattle sickness in the summer of 1887 that cost them a portion of the herd and required careful management to recover from. A dispute with a neighboring landowner over the placement of a new road that Owen handled with his characteristic combination of patience and absolute firmness. A winter in 1888 that was so severe that several people in the valley did not survive it and left the community with a sober and lasting grief. Life in the territory was not gentle. It had never been gentle. But it was real and it was full and it was, in the way that matters most, deeply good. Daniel grew into a serious boy with an unexpected gift for figures, which Marcella encouraged with the same conviction her father had brought to education. By the time he was 8, he was doing the ranch accounts beside Owen on winter evenings, which Owen found both impressive and slightly humbling. Robert grew into a loud, cheerful, physically bold child who fell out of trees with enough regularity that Dr. Clara Hatch, who had established herself permanently in Cimarron, began to greet his arrivals at her office with an expression of resigned familiarity. In the spring of 1888, a daughter arrived. They named her Alina, because Marcella had loved the name since childhood, and Alina arrived in the world with a calm watchfulness that was different from both her brothers, and that turned out to be characteristic. She was, from very early, the family member most likely to be found sitting quietly in a corner observing everyone else with great interest and storing the observations for later use. Owen looked at his daughter on the first night of her life with an expression that Marcella had not seen before on his face. A very specific tenderness that was different from what he felt for the boys, not more or less, but differently shaped, and she loved him for it. Rosa finally retired in the fall of 1888, not to Santa Fe, but to a house in Cimarron that she bought with her savings, and from which she visited the ranch with comfortable regularity, arriving on Sundays with food she had made in quantities that she claimed were for no reason, but that everyone understood were because she was incapable of not feeding people she loved. A young woman named Paz came to help in the house, and she was capable and kind, and the household adjusted and continued. The water maps were published in 1889 in a formal document compiled by the Territorial Land Office, with Marcella Keene Hadley credited as the primary cartographic source. She held the published document in her hands at the kitchen table on the afternoon it arrived by post, and she read her father's name in the acknowledgement section, original surveys conducted by Augusto Keene, 1861–1879, and the emotion that moved through her was complex and deep and finally, fully, peaceful. Owen was there when she read it. He saw her face and didn't say anything, just placed his hand over hers on the table, and she turned her hand over and held his. Daniel asked what the document was and she explained it, and he looked at it with the focused attention he brought to everything, and then he said, "Grandfather did this." And she said yes, and he looked at it for a while longer and then said, "Can I borrow the red pencil?" and went back to the calculation he had been working on at the other end of the table, and she smiled at the practicality of children. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary in September of 1892, Owen arranged something. He would not tell her what it was. He told her on a Thursday that she should be ready on Saturday afternoon to ride out, and that she should wear her good coat because the evenings were cool, and they would be late back. She spent the Friday in a state of amused curiosity, and Rosa, who was visiting for Sunday and had arrived a day early with apparently no awareness that this might have been coordinated, pretended to know nothing. On Saturday afternoon, he saddled both their horses and they rode out together, leaving the children in the care of Paz and Rosa, east across the mesa in the golden September light. She knew the direction before they had ridden half an hour. She knew every feature of this land, had ridden it for 10 years, had mapped parts of it herself. He had been there earlier in the day. She could see that when they arrived at the mesa bowl with the spring and the red walls and the sky. He had brought a blanket and spread it near the edge of the pool, and there was a basket with food and a bottle of wine, a proper Bordeaux that he had ordered through the general store from Santa Fe, which was not a simple thing to do, and she knew it. The wildflowers were different in September late-season things, tougher and more muted, the yellow of chamisa and the purple of asters along the pool's edge. The water was the same, cold and clear. The red walls held the late light. She stood at the edge of the pool and looked around at all of it, the same place she had stood 10 years ago, when he had told her that she and this place belonged in the same afternoon, the most beautifully simple declaration she had ever received. 10 years, he said from behind her. 10 years, she agreed. He came to stand beside her, and they looked at the pool and the flowers and the walls in the evening light. "Are you happy?" he asked. She turned to look at him. He was 42 now, with lines at the corners of his eyes and more gray in his hair than there had been, and a steadiness about him that had only deepened over the years into something that felt like bedrock. He was looking at her with the same expression he had worn the first morning she had sat in his kitchen eating breakfast, the same expression from the dry creek bed and the porch under the stars and every significant moment in between, careful, genuine, completely open. "Owen," she said. "Yes," he said, not a question. "I rode to your ranch 10 years ago to demand an apology," she said. "You gave me one, and then you asked me if I was hungry." "I did," he said. "That is the best thing that has ever happened to me," she said, "and I have had a lot of good things happen to me." He looked at her for a long moment, and then the smile came, the one that had never stopped surprising her, even after 10 years, the one that made him look entirely young and entirely himself. "Come here," he said, and opened his arms, and she stepped into them and felt them close around her with the warm solidity of something completely reliable, and she rested her head against his chest and heard his heart beating and looked out at the pool and the flowers and the sky going slowly pink above the red walls. "Happy," she said. "Yes, I am completely, entirely happy." He kissed the top of her head and held her there in the September evening, with the spring running clear beside them, and the mesa spread out wide and real in every direction. They ate their supper on the blanket by the pool as the stars came out, the same stars, the eternal ridiculous abundance of stars over the New Mexico territory, and they talked and were quiet and talked again, and the wine was good and the food was good, and the air smelled of sage and stone and late flowers. When they finally rode home in the dark, side by side on the mesa road with the moon rising, Marcella thought about the shape of a life, how it starts in one direction and then turns, how the most important turns are usually initiated by something small and ordinary, a fence that breaks, a field of alfalfa, a piece of paper in a coat pocket, a woman who decides enough is enough and rides 6 miles in the cold morning to say so. She thought about her father, whose maps had run underground through the whole story like water through limestone, surfacing when they were needed. She thought about Rosa, who had set an extra plate without being asked, and who was probably right now telling Daniel some story at the kitchen table while Eleanor sat in the corner, observing, and Robert found something to climb. She thought about the word yes, and all the specific places she had said it. She thought about Owen, riding beside her in the moonlight, who had been honest with her every single time it mattered, and who had shown her a secret spring, and held her hand under the stars, and stood in the yard in the September light 10 years ago, looking at her walking, toward him as though he still could not quite believe his luck. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About the fence," she said. He laughed, a full, genuine laugh, the kind that came rarely and meant everything. "After 10 years," he said. "After 10 years," she said, "I still think about the fence." "Me too," he said. "Every time I ride the boundary line." She smiled in the dark. The mesa road unfolded ahead of them, familiar and certain, leading home. They came through the gate of the ranch, and she could see the lights in the windows, warm yellow light. The light of a house that was inhabited and alive. The light her father's house had once held, and that she had carried forward into this new place. She could hear faintly the sound of a child laughing, which was probably Robert, and the lower sound of a voice that was Rosa, and the particular silence of Daniel working on something. Owen dismounted and came to her side before she had finished swinging down, and he offered his hand and she took it, and they walked the horses to the barn together in the dark. "Tomorrow," he said, as they unsaddled, "I was thinking of riding out to check the eastern fence line." "I'll come with you," she said. "I was hoping you'd say that." They put the horses up and walked back toward the lit windows, toward the voices and the warmth, toward everything that had been built from a broken fence and an honest apology and a question about breakfast on a cold spring morning a decade ago. She pushed open the kitchen door and the warmth came out to meet her, Rose's cooking, wood smoke, lamp oil, the smell of home. And Daniel looked up from the table with Owen's gray eyes in her father's face and said, "Papa, Robert tried to get up on the barn roof." And Owen said, "Robert, we have talked about this." And Robert said from somewhere in the next room, "I didn't fall," which was technically true. And Alina looked up from her corner and met her mother's eyes with a look of complete, composed awareness. Marcella hung her coat on the peg by the door and looked around the kitchen, at her husband, at her children, at Rosa by the stove pretending not to be pleased, at the shelf of books with their cracked spines, at the worn spot on the floor in front of the stove that she had made herself over 10 years of mornings. She thought, this is what becomes of 6 miles of cold riding and a list of grievances and the particular stubbornness of a woman who decides she has been patient long enough. She thought, this is what becomes of a man who could have made excuses and instead said simply, "You are right," and then asked if she was hungry. She crossed the kitchen and kissed the top of Daniel's head and told Robert through the doorway that the barn roof topic was not closed, and she sat down at the table, and the evening arranged itself around her, Owen filling a cup of water, Rosa making the sounds of supper being managed, Alina sliding off her corner chair and coming to lean against Marcella's arm with the quiet warmth of a child who has decided where she wants to be. Outside, the September night held the territory in its dark and cool hands, the same mesa, the same stars, the same land that had held her father's footprints and her own, and that would hold her children's after them. The spring running clean beneath the rock, the fences standing, the water mapped and documented and defended, the story of this place continuing past any single life that had moved through it. Marcella Keene Hadley sat at her kitchen table with her daughter's warmth against her arm and her husband's voice in the room, and the whole gathered good weight of her life around her. And she felt completely, entirely, without reservation, that everything was exactly as it should be. The lantern burned. The night settled. Somewhere out on the mesa, a coyote called once, received no answer and was quiet. The house held them all as it had always held them, as it would continue to hold them, and the walls knew every word that had ever been said in them and were glad.